Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Godzilla series with King Kong vs. Godzilla, which I have both on DVD and on VHS. Now, this was released in Japan in 1962, but it was released in America in 1963, and kind of like what they did with the first two Godzilla movies, when they brought it over to America, it was drastically re-edited to a point where the American version is basically a different film than the original Japanese version. Now, back in 2018, me and my friend Jeremy reviewed all the King Kong movies, and we did review this movie, but in that review we talked about both the Japanese cut and the American cut. So what I decided to do in this video is just focus on the American cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla. Now, King Kong vs. Godzilla is the third film in the Godzilla franchise, the first two films in this franchise being 1954's Gojira and 1955's Godzilla Raids Again. And this movie features the character of King Kong, who originated from the 1933 classic from Marion C. Cooper. Now, it should be noted that this is not in continuity with the 1933 film or its sequel, Son of Kong. So, in this movie, we're dealing with Toho's version of King Kong, which is different from the original version of the character because this version of King Kong actually has superpowers. He gets his powers from electricity. Now, from what I understand, Willis O'Brien, who did the effects work in the original King Kong, wanted to do a movie where King Kong fights the Frankenstein monster. Eventually, a script was written called King Kong vs. Prometheus, and the rights to this script were sold to John Beck, and then John Beck sold it to Toho, and Toho decided to just make King Kong vs. Godzilla, but they incorporated aspects of the Frankenstein monster into King Kong. And Toho actually would later do their own Frankenstein movie, Frankenstein Conquers the World, also known as Frankenstein vs. Baragon, which had a sequel called War of the Gargantuas. That's the basic gist of how this movie got made. I am glossing over a lot of stuff, but that's a boiled down version of how this movie was conceived. Now, from what I understand, Marion C. Cooper, the co-creator of the original King Kong, was not too happy about this movie. Now, even though this review is gonna primarily be on the American cut, I do gotta give a few words on the major differences between the American cut and the original Japanese cut. Basically, the Japanese cut was a comedy and a satire. It was basically a parody of the first two Godzilla movies and of the original King Kong. And the original Japanese version had a lot of satire on marketing and advertising, and it also had a lot of satire on the westernization of Japan. So like the original Godzilla, it did have a lot of social commentary, but it wasn't taken as seriously as the original film was. The American version of King Kong vs. Godzilla basically removes a lot of the comedy and removes a lot of the satire, and they make it more of a generic monster movie. And they removed Akira Ifukube's score for the movie, and they replaced it with stock Universal music because this movie was released by Universal when it was released here in the States. Particularly music from Creature from the Black Lagoon, and I know music from a few of their other movies was used for the soundtrack for the American cut. They also added additional scenes directed by Thomas Montgomery of a UN reporter reporting on King Kong and Godzilla's fight. Very reminiscent of what they did with the original Godzilla, where when they brought that over to the States, they added additional scenes of Raymond Burr. Now, all that being said, even though this version of the film removes a lot of the satire and the more intellectual aspects of the movie, I actually like this cut of the movie better, and I know for some Godzilla fans that's probably blasphemy, but in the case of King Kong vs. Godzilla, I actually prefer the American cut. I don't know, whenever I try to watch the original Japanese version, it just doesn't feel right to me, even though that was the original version. And granted, a lot of this could just be nostalgia, because this was actually my first Godzilla movie. When I was a little kid, my grandparents had both this and Godzilla 1985 on VHS, and I would watch these movies all the time whenever I was over their house. And as a little kid, this was the movie that really defined King Kong and Godzilla for me. So, I think since I first saw this as a little kid, so much of what was added for the American version, I have come to associate with the movie so much that this really has become my preferred version. But it's funny because I also grew up on Godzilla King of the Monsters, the Americanized version of the original film, but when I finally saw the original Japanese cut, Gojira, I could never watch Godzilla King of the Monsters again, knowing how much better the original Japanese version was. I think maybe because King Kong vs. Godzilla is not meant to be taken as seriously as the original Godzilla film, I don't mind watching the American cut. Now, the plot of King Kong vs. Godzilla is it begins where an American submarine crashes into an iceberg, releasing Godzilla. This is kind of picking up where Godzilla Raids Again left off, because that movie ended where the Japanese military managed to trap Godzilla in ice. However, if you watch the American cut of this movie, they kind of act like this is the first time Godzilla's ever shown up, whereas if you watch the original Japanese cut, they do refer to the events of the first two movies. But long story short, Godzilla is back and he once again threatens Japan and possibly the rest of the world. Meanwhile, you start following this advertising agency representing a pharmaceutical company, and the head of this agency, he's pissed off that nobody's watching their show, that their shows are getting horrible ratings, and he hears about this legend of a giant gorilla from a place called Faro Island, which is basically this movie's stand-in for Skull Island. So he sends two of his employees to this island to capture the gorilla, which is called King Kong, and eventually they do capture it, and while trying to bring it to Japan, King Kong escapes, and now King Kong threatens Japan. So now the Japanese military's plan is to try to bring King Kong and Godzilla together in the hopes that they destroy each other and mankind will be spared their destructive rampage. And that's the basic plot of King Kong vs. Godzilla. Now, the characters in the movie are fun, but they're certainly not as deep or complex as the characters from the original film, but again, this is not meant to be taken as seriously as the original film. I do want to note that one of the actresses in this movie who plays a character named Fumiko, who kind of becomes the Andaro stand-in at one point where King Kong kidnaps her, she's played by an actress named Mai Hama, and she's perhaps most famous for being a Bond girl. She was in the James Bond film You Only Live Twice. Also, Akihiko Hirata, who played Sekizawa in the original film, has a small role in this movie as a scientist who works for the Japanese government. Obviously, it's not Sekizawa, because Sekizawa died in the first movie, and also he has both his eyes in this movie. But I absolutely love King Kong vs. Godzilla. This is one of my favorite monster movies, and this is probably my favorite Godzilla sequel, at least from the Showa era. But specifically the American cut. Again, the Japanese cut is good and is technically superior, but I don't know, I guess for nostalgic reasons, I just prefer to watch the American cut. But regardless of what cut of the movie you see, the highlight of this movie is definitely the monster battles between King Kong and Godzilla, which are probably some of my favorite kaiju fights of all time. And sure, the King Kong suit is cheesy. I will say Godzilla in this movie, this is actually my favorite look for Godzilla out of any of the Showa films. And there is actually one shot of stop motion where King Kong and Godzilla are done in claymation, and that was really cool. You could tell that was Eiji Tsuburaya's tribute to Willis O'Brien, because Eiji Tsuburaya was a huge admirer of Willis O'Brien's effects work in the original King Kong. Now, there is going to be a remake of this movie called Godzilla vs. Kong, which will be in the same continuity as the 2014 Godzilla reboot from Gareth Edwards, as well as Kong Skull Island and 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters. It was originally going to come out, I think, in May of this year, but unfortunately, because of the coronavirus, it got pushed back. I think it got originally pushed back to November of this year, but now it's been pushed back again to sometime in 2021, I think in February. but I look forward to it whenever we get to see it. But I did hear that there have been numerous reshoots, so that definitely raises a few eyebrows, but you know what? I'm such a Godzilla fan that even if the movie sucks, I'm sure I'll find some enjoyment out of it. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut to a short review that my friend Christian Feliciano did on this film. Now, in the review of this movie that I did with my friend Jeremy, I also included a short review from him on this movie in that review, but this is a different review that he recorded. When I asked him to contribute to these videos, I forgot to tell him that he didn't really have to give me a review of this one, but since he did, here it is.
Now that we got the artsy-fartsy stuff out of the way, now that we got the anti-war message out of the way, now that we got all the seriousness out of the way, let's start with the bullshit. King Kong versus Godzilla. Now, it sounds like I'm going to bash this film. Hell no, I love King Kong versus Godzilla. This is one of the best films ever. I freaking love it. It's one of the baddest things you can ever imagine. Putting these two creatures together who were in separate films, you know, and just have them beat the shit out of each other is the best thing I can ever imagine. Like, this is what I dream of. Just putting creatures together and make them fight. I love it. You know, I always loved when Godzilla, they went crazy with these kaiju films. I love the craziness in these films. It's fun how Godzilla is still the villain in this. So if you don't want to see Godzilla be the villain, it's going to be a little bit disappointing to you because, you know, you want to see Godzilla be the superhero. That's, to me, I've always loved when Godzilla was a superhero. I always loved when Godzilla was the hero, the savior of humanity, and he had to fight off these other creatures. So in that sense, it does disappoint me a little bit when I watch it because I wish Godzilla wasn't the bad one. I wish that Godzilla and King Kong had did that whole Batman v Superman thing where they fight for some weird reason, some villain puts them up against each other, and then they both realize that they're the last of their species and their mother's names were Martha, and they decided, you know, we're going to just team up and take down this villain. I wish they did that, but okay, since we got the film we got, I'm fine with that. I'm sure that's going to happen in the remake anyway. I'm sure when they remake it, they're going to find out their mother was, I don't know, named something that I can't pronounce. But yeah, that's going to be fun. But for now, you know, I love watching this film. Godzilla vs. King Kong is one of the greatest films. One of the coolest things I love in this one is that we see a giant octopus. Now, in real life, I'm really scared of seeing an octopus because octopus to me, or octopi, I don't know how you say multiple octopus, but octopuses, that sounds dirty for some reason. Anyway, those creatures scare me, and the idea of a giant one, because they are quite intelligent, is just terrifying. But I do love to see one of those, so I love that King Kong does fight one. I thought that's awesome. You know, I just really enjoyed that scene. The human stuff in this is already getting towards the later films where it matters, but at the end of the day, what you're here to see is the two creatures fight. That, to me, that's how I take it. I mean, I love the humans. I can watch the film over and over again, and I love the humans, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, at this point, you know, you can pretty much just watch it to see the creatures fight, and you'll enjoy it. Like, you don't really, at this point, need the humans because it's not really about anything serious anymore. This is about two creatures beating the shit out of each other. This was just for fun, a big blockbuster. And yeah, I really enjoy Godzilla vs. King Kong. This is great. I love it to death. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to my review, and bye-bye.
But I hope you enjoyed Christian's short review of this movie, and that was my review on King Kong vs. Godzilla, and bye.